Thank you very, very much indeed. It's been an extremely intense day already, and it's quite great to see you all here gathered. So many could actually be enjoying a drink at the bar, or hanging out with friends or new partners in crime. So thank you very much for bearing with us. And it's actually great that the RF always bring such a great panel on each opening evening. And I thank you for introducing the panelists already, because this will save me time, because if I were going in each of everyone's biography, it would take ages because they've been doing so much. It's quite remarkable. I must say that the title caught my attention. It's not common these days to hear that the West is wild, but certainly not double, twice as wild. It's just that they thought Rachel and I, as a good American and a good European, would join the panel. It was worth calling it wild. So we have seen over the past few years, if not months, an acceleration of the recomposing of the geopolitical landscape in the world between traditional allies, but especially in the Pacific. And in this regard, the Pacific has served as an interesting laboratory of the global recomposing at work. So without much further ado, and I'd like this to be as interactive as possible, so we normally have 10 minutes of Q&A in the end, but if there's something like a question or comment or burning thing that we are overlooking, just catch my eye. There's a microphone somewhere. I'd like to start with you, Professor Pand. You have covered extensively India's partnerships in the region, Indonesia, of course, 75 years of relations. I think it's something that your country must be proud of, and Japan as well. At the same time, India has been a very important, in spite of the most recent trade developments, partner of the United States. So how has India navigated this geopolitical recomposing? Deepening alliances and trying to uphold wobbling ones?
Well, I think it's, on the US-India front, as we have seen in the last couple of days, it's been a bit wobbly. But I think what has happened is, in some ways, India's partnership with the US, as it has evolved over the last few decades in particular, and as it has grown across governments on both sides, it has also allowed India to build partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. And I think there has been this convergence because America being a very important player in this part of the world, and India and the US working together in so many ways has ensured that India's partnerships with a number of other players would also accelerate. And I think India-Japan partnership, for example, is something which has been very interesting, because we have talked about India-Japan partnership for very long as being natural partners, and how there is hardly any divergence there. But there was a point when it began to get a bit wobbly, to use your word. And I think it required a new sense of purpose once the Shinzo Abe framework of the Indo-Pacific came into place. And once the two sides recognized the need to embed their bilateral partnership in the wider regional context. So you had the Quad coming in, you had other trilateral and other partnerships with ASEAN coming in. And I think that allowed India and Japan to do things that perhaps, or to envision things which they were not imagining before. So in a certain sense, what you were saying as two distinct trajectories, actually we started together. And now as we look at, and we had discussed this in the last panel, and there has been a degree of retrenchment of the US, a degree of transactionalism that has set in American behavior. It will have an impact on India's partnerships in this part of the world. And I think that would be, to watch out for. But I think the aspiration should be, and would be, I hope, that we continue to insulate our partnerships which have developed over the last few decades from this wider problems that are emerging from either from the US or from the wider contestation on US, between US and China. And I think that's the aspiration, I guess, also of a large number of Southeast Asian countries. And I think increasingly what we also see is something that Japan and Australia, traditional partners in the Indo-Pacific, want to do. So I think India-Indonesia partnership, therefore, would be very critical. Someone pointed out in the last panel, what if can you replace the US with Indonesia? and make another Quad. But it may be a bit far-fetched, but I think it underscores the commitment in some ways of India and other regional players to start building their own engagement in the region to ensure that some of the large trends can be put aside and you can insulate the regional dynamic from that broader purpose. So I think that's the trajectory, and you still remain hopeful that despite Mr. Trump, eventually the structural realities would play themselves out and you would come back to the basics. But that's something we'll have to wait and watch and see how this develops.
Thank you very much. I'd very much love to come back on the Quad, having two distinguished representatives of two members, namely Japan and the US. But before I do that, I'd like to turn to you, Ira, because you've covered many different topics in the field of defense as well, and this has been it's meant to be a growing keystone of India-Indonesia relations, but also of Pacific partnerships. And Indonesia has been doing quite a lot to advance local production, to grow self-reliance. What is the prospect for defense to become the new fuel of India-Indonesia cooperation?
Thank you so much. That's a very interesting question. I think one of the things for sure, Indonesia and India shared a similar principle in its foreign policy, which is non-alignment, and it is rooted deep in the colonial history of Indonesia and India. And one of the things for sure, I think both countries trying to actually create like an omni-enmeshment or a balance of influence between like the great powers inside its country. For Indonesia, for example, Indonesia has conducting many parts in which to realize like the free and active foreign policy, which is bebas and aktif in Bahasa Indonesia. But to some extent, I think there is a different interpretation between like one president to another president. For the current president, as we see, he tried to actually not only active in the term of like global politics and global organization, but also bilaterally. I think one of the countries that is engaged by Indonesia in Prabowo's early presidency is India. And this is the first time in history, even though Indonesia and India has a long history of interrelations, I think India's popular culture is very popular in Indonesia, so everyone knows Kuch Kuch Hutai, the lyrics from beginning to the end. And one of the things for sure, that story like Ramayana is very popular here and even adapted to the local culture. Even though we have a long history on that, we haven't had like a significant security cooperation between like one another. So I think one of the things for sure is that when the DCA is signed earlier this year, it opened a lot of opportunity that haven't been talked about before, including in defense industry. So this is one of the things that is actually complementary between both countries. Because one thing that makes why defense cooperation, especially in defense industry, is very important for Indonesia and India is that because Indonesia and India both are diversifying their arms procurement. And India is actually cooperating closely with Russia, who inherited the USSR technology. Indonesia, on the other hand, is having a difficulty in procuring from Russia, but 35% of our total arms procurement are actually conducted with USSR, the previous one, so it's pretty old. But India provide a gap, the solution for the gap, to actually procure something that is related to the Soviet technology, but not directly dealing with the Russia. And interestingly, I think Indonesia was planning to procure Sukhoi, the fourth generation aircraft, but then we are threatened by Katsa. So one of the things for sure, this opened a window of opportunity to actually like cooperating with India, especially since there's a shortage of supply from Russia due to Russia-Ukraine war. So I do believe that it's very complementary. One thing for sure, I think India and Indonesia is trying to build like a further relations. Even though it's actually like summit cooperation this far, like Prabowo is invited to like military parade in India, but I think we can explore the cooperation further through joint R&D, for example, because Indonesia is very lacking in R&D, especially because our budget in R&D compared to MILEX is only about like 2% or 3% from the total military expenditure. And India is conducting a very excellent job in the research department, especially in cultivating new company, so a startup company in defense corporations. Other than that, I think it's about the contract trade. So I think we can start small, not starting big. But yes, for sure, currently there are some trade relations happening in the defense industry, but it's not significant yet, and we are hoping to see more of that, because I think this will create a benefit, since India is producing like excellent technology, and Indonesia is also trying to become a part of global supply chain in defense industry. But however, I think we have to be aware that this actually provides a diplomatic benefit in that, because both of the countries try to balance each other. And the last one is regarding joint development. So how both countries can actually create a joint project within each other. So I do believe that in terms of security, there is actually unexplored territory that could be explored further in the future, because I mean, like, the START is already there, the DCA is already there. Probably there will be like future DCAs in the future that talk about like more, deeper things rather than that.
Well, thank you. It's fascinating because I mean, summarizing in great lines what you stress, it's also the feeling that the impact of the previous geopolitical age is still there, all the dying, and another kind of order is emerging, and we stand in between. And this is definitely where we need political leadership, which we sense here in Indonesia and certainly so in India. And also economic kind of opportunities, and how do you make sure the defense industry benefit the more broader economy. We mentioned the Quad and political leadership, and that's why I wanted to turn to you, Professor Jimbo. I mean, the Quad owes a lot to Japan and to the leadership of the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. My question would be blunt. Is there still space for Japanese leadership in the Pacific, and especially with the new US administration?
Thank you very much. I think that Japan's emerging strategy is placed upon the increasing awareness that we are surrounded by very severe security environment. And this is the moving target, because China has keep on rising. North Korea fully determined to become a nuclear power. Russia no longer hesitate to be a spoiler in that situation. And China overtook Japan's GDP in 2010, and now they are 3 times bigger than us. On the defense budget, they took over us in 2005. Now they are 6 times bigger than that. So we have decided to double the size of defense budget in recent national security strategy, but it doesn't really fill any kind of gap. The constant inferiority on our side really makes the new kind of formula that we really need to keep on the durable strategy to how to deal with it. So one thing that desperately needed is the salience of the US security commitment over the allies. Japan, Korea, Australia, Philippines, all combined. At the time that the United States has been so reluctant to offer the free lunch over this. And everything has become like a paid thing. It's like a subscription system. If you want to have a new, nice content, so you have to pay more. And that's where the transactionalism on the US security commitment is all about. But we don't really have a luxury for those kind of ambiguity to take place, because there's a window of opportunity for change of the status quo by force everywhere, from the low-level hybrid threats to the gray zone to the upper end of the escalation, such as in Taiwan. In that place, that there are so many kind of fixation that we really need to fill, and then that has to be done primarily by our own strengths, and how much we can really deal to play a role as a denial defense against the potential adversaries. And denial defense really works at the time that we are able to deny their prospect of the change of the status quo by force. And this is a very important the way that why we are having a long-range strike capability, because we are trying to impose the cost upon any kinds of such kind of operation like amphibious vessels. So now that, the second, I think, motivation is how to create the networks of the capabilities and willingness to provide the whole thing. So the whole, the Quad idea's origin is, of course, we need to engage India first. But the actual operation of the Quad is in between those bilateral relationship among the Quad members. We are not always side by side to operate together in everywhere in the field, but we do share the standards of the operation. What kind of, I think, the standards, morals, and how they can be translated into maritime security, and also the safety standards, and what kind of level of the interoperability among the forces that those are the practices that daily happen even outside the Quad. And this is, I think, what the Quad is now trying to formulate, is formulate as a standard setter rather than operating together.
Very interesting. I mean, it sounds to me like an alternative solution to becoming, in the words of President Macron regarding NATO, turning brain dead. So it's really interesting. I'll turn to you, Rachel, on that. When Prime Minister Abe, came up with this idea 21 years ago already, he was met with rather warm support from Vice President Cheney. To what extent can this alternative solution, so working together on standard settings, still work without American support?
So I think that's an interesting question, and to get to the heart of it, I think you need to look at the way that Trump approaches multilateralism versus how other US presidents have approached multilateralism. And the joy I get from speaking as an American at foreign policy conferences is that I always have to try to explain Trump to people, which is an almost impossible thing to do because his mood, his decisions change almost daily. But I think one thing that's important to understand is that Donald Trump has an extreme recency bias. So whether he's had a conversation with Howard Lutnick or Scott Bessent or Jameson Greer, you'll see those opinions and approaches sort of reflected in Trump's soon thereafter. It's also important to understand that there is this push and pull within the Trump administration. People think that this administration is mostly 90% focused on the US competition with China. And I would say that that's true because when you put people like Elbridge Colby, who's the third highest ranking official at the Pentagon, he's known as a prioritizer and sees this China first approach to the US. You kind of have his approach versus other folks like Rubio, Lindsey Graham in the Senate, Mike Waltz, I would put in this category, who see US primacy and US leadership as not just in the Indo-Pacific, but as something that the United States has to do everywhere. And so I think there's a push and pull between these different camps within the Trump administration. But what I will say, and this is going to come back to the Quad, I promise, Trump takes this very layered approach to geopolitics, right? So you have multilateralism that and multilateral institutions that he views not as a way for the United States to project power, but as a constraint on American power, right? So he's always willing to undermine multilateral frameworks in favor of bilateral deals. And he further is always willing to undermine bilateral deals in favor of whatever personal goals he might be trying to reach. So in this top level with multilateralism, we've seen this play out at the G7. We've seen it play out at NATO. And as someone that works on the EU and the European Union and NATO, it's been a huge headache to try to explain this over the last few months. And we're also seeing it happen now bilaterally with India, where he views India's purchases of Russian oil as a hindrance to the outcome he's trying to reach in the Russia-Ukraine war. And my worry is that these tensions, especially between the United States and India, will end up playing out in the Quad at some point. Whether it's the US pulling out of some of the working groups within the Quad, whether it's saying, you know, Japan, Australia, India, you better make this deal with us or else we are disengaging. And at that point, I say to Indo-Pacific allies and partners the same thing that I say to European allies, is that it's time to take your security into your own hands, because at this point, I don't view the United States as a real reliable partner or actor. And the way that these multilateral frameworks can move forward and strengthen is if other frameworks emerge from them, I think.
This resonates with me, especially when I hear, you know, the word pressure and no alternative. The Tina catchphrase of Margaret Thatcher, there's no alternative. Professor Penn, what is the real driver of a deepening of the cooperation in the Pacific? What are the elephants in the room or around it? Is it the current administration? Is it China? Is it climate? Is it all of that? I sense this could help us better understand and measure the prospect of what a deepened cooperation, of course, between India and Indonesia, but also between the larger countries of the region could look like.
I think when, you know, so this is slightly a longish story. So India started looking east, as it were, in early 1990s after it opened itself up and started this whole liberalization process. And then it was called Look East policy. And the idea was that as India was opening up to the world, you had these major economies in the Pacific, in East, Japan and other Southeast Asian tigers, who would benefit who would help India in that journey of integration into the global economic order. And I think that was primarily being looked at through an economic lens. That was an economic argument that then Indian government was making to itself and negotiating a set of priorities that India, during the Cold War, got so insulated from the world that the Pacific, where the real interesting economic activity was happening, actually moved ahead and India was left behind. And I think from there started this journey, which has now become the Act East policy. So in 2014, when the Modi government came to power, they sort of christened it differently. And they said this is now going to be, we are going to act east, not simply look east. And then the primary driver became strategic. And I think the issues that you had mentioned, of course, the changing balance of power was a very important driver. But at that point in time, or perhaps to a certain extent even today, America was an enabler for Indian presence, Indian engagement, India's partnerships. If the present trends continue, then America will be seen as a problem. And I think a lot of what Rachel talked about was actually saying that, look, America is the problem, and therefore, how do you plan your Act East policy or your engagements with your partners, assuming that America is not there, or America will create more problems than it will resolve. So I think therein lies, I think, a lot of the dilemmas that India and perhaps other countries are facing, because we also had this slightly conversation earlier on in the previous panel, where this recognition that the kind of capacity that America brings to the table makes your ability to stand up to China, for example, they become more credible. Without America, there is still a lot of wobbliness in the system. And therefore, when you talk of trilateral partnerships or India's partnerships with its own, with Japan, with Australia, they need to become much more robust, much more dynamic, much more able to absorb disruption than they are at the moment, because our reliance on the US for all the claims that we have made in the past is still very high. Now the question is, where do we go from here, and whether we can, I think what Ken was pointing out was whether we can imagine and build those capacities that are not present at the moment. And therefore, a partnership, for example, like India and Indonesia, we both are very fond of saying we want strategic autonomy. And I think this is the time to demonstrate that autonomy, because now the time has come, we have talked about it enough. Now the time has come to demonstrate whether our strategic autonomy and our ability to shape regional power dynamic has any legs to stand on.
So Europe framed the concept, they failed at implementing it, and hopefully the region will manage to do so. Talking about Europe, I mean, it's obviously the missing word in that discussion. France, although very, very small country, is a Pacific country, the only one in the Western Hemisphere. Is Europe still relevant in your view, Professor Jimbo, in the region? And if it could be a better partner, what would it call for?
Well, former Prime Minister Kishida once said that the Ukraine today will be maybe East Asia tomorrow, which tried to address the interconnectivity of the security affairs in both regions. The failure of deterrence in Ukraine might happen in Taiwan, so that better watch out about what really constitute the change of the behavior of those potential aggressors, of the adversaries, so that we really have to keep an eye on the European deterrence situation and how the composition of those kind of security structure that will have a lot of like a cross-referencing effect on Asia. That's one thing, how Europe is important. Secondly, we definitely welcome Europe's pivot or engagement in the Indo-Pacific. There has been the gravity effects of the Europeans, adoptions and adherence to the Indo-Pacific strategy, which brings us a lot of benefits to us. One thing is that we don't really have a delusion that the Europeans are fight side by side with us. But dispatchment of so many forces and deployments and having a joint exercises create a lot of like a normative effect, because allow me to mention about China. China defines everything as domestic. Senkaku domestic, Taiwan domestic, South China Sea all domestic issue. But if Europeans come and say, no, this is the international problem with a global concern, it has a doubling down effect on creating those kind of narratives, which really, I think, at the things that the Europeans' point of the value creations and normative effects are so important. And that's two things. And third is, I think it's a diversification of our alternative choices. For example, it's a tariff negotiation, how much we can really set the kind of, not the common position, but the coordinated position with Europe has eventually creates the leverage point for us to deal with Washington, D.C. And what about the defense industrial bases? We are doing the GCAP with the UK and Italy, and we wish to be part of the Pillar 2 of the AUKUS to create the better industrial base for the R&D, and eventually it's a market kind of presumptions of gaining this. Unfortunately, AUKUS Pillar 1 is not doing well. Australia,
as a French national, I can't rejoice.
They should choose Japan at the outset. But now that, by the way, we had a good news that Australia tried to adopt our frigate ships, and we are waiting for their decision to come to us on the submarines as well. But by the way, that really is the alternative, and I think it was unimaginable. I think 20 years ago that Japan provides any kind of final products to other cities. India having a kind of the joint production with the United States. It's a really kind of diversified sense of how much of those choices can create we discuss about creating the sense of the strategic autonomy in the alternative setting.
There's something immediately that come to mind, and I will go back to you, both Professor Penn and Jimbo, about the role of political personalities. President Modi is personally one of the most trusted leaders around the world. He's enjoyed a strong relation with Donald Trump, with most of European leaders. I don't need to mention Shinzo Abe, and Shinzo Abe is not here anymore. And so what's the benefit and the risk of having very strong relations between leaders? Because when they're gone, you tend to lose that. But before we get to that point, I'd like to ask Ira, is that defense cooperation an opportunity to bring Europe closer to the region here at a time when they look to grow the demand for their homegrown defense industry doesn't look good now after the deal with the US, but there's still the ambition in the air.
Definitely, yes. I think both Indonesia and India are conducting, as I mentioned before, non-alignment position in the global international system. So including European countries in that sense is quite sensible because they have a top-tier military industry, first of all that, and top-tier player in the global supply chain in military industry, as well as the political burden that dealing with the European states is not as big when you're dealing with like the competing power. For example, currently I think US has like a very it has a very sophisticated like military and defense industry. However, I think there are some problem with the US's technology. I think India doesn't have this type of problem because I think US has a special place for India in its international relations. Even Rachel say that Trump presidency sees this as a burden, but Russia can actually cut the Katsa and have like a good relations with Russia and developing a joint technology, which is BrahMos, which was developed based on the Yakon ballistic missile, which is amazing. And one thing for sure, I think, cooperation between Indonesia and the US has been going for quite a long time. 30% of our arms procurement came from the US, but we have like several limitations, including budgetary limitations, because Indonesia only allocated about like 13% of its total MILEX for modernization, which is quite small. And one thing for sure, I think when we talk about strategic autonomy and we talk about independence, the thing that we have to make sure is that we have the bargaining capacity in order to actually stand our ground when something happens. One of the things that become the main threat for Indonesia, both Indonesia and India currently, is when the war broke out in the Asia-Pacific, for example, in Taiwan, in the South China Sea. One thing for sure, aside from how the war will have like a spillover effect for us, is how we actually maintain our independence in that conditions. Because to some extent, I think the great power will ask us about access, will actually actually have like an effect on our superiority, for example, or like territorial security. So one thing for sure is that we have to do that. But cooperation with the US has lots of benefit. The technology is battle proven, but it is so expensive. Let's be real for now. It's so expensive. Meanwhile, I think Indonesia is starting to actually have a alternative partner, which ranging from the European countries to Asian countries. I think Turkey has become like one of Indonesia's favorite in the recent years, and India is soon. I think one of the things is like the procurement of propellant from India, to Indonesia. And one thing for sure, I think the European technology, we're talking about like general European technology, is battle proven. First of all, it's that. And second of all, I think it is actually easier to deal bureaucratically and less burden in the diplomatic aspect because it doesn't directly link to the problem in Asia-Pacific. But in terms of like how we engage, I think it's not only limited to the defense industry, but also it is actually like conducted in various aspects, such as, for example, like satellite technology and space science, for example, and many more aspects, because I think Europe can play a bigger role in the Asia-Pacific as a middleman to actually bridge the gap relations between like China and the US.
It's an excellent transition to what I wanted to ask Rachel, so playing the middleman. But to do that, it seems that Europe needs to be credible. And my question is, if I'm in the region, I could ask my neighbors, do I trust Europe when I feel like it might be under the influence of the US because they're weak? I mean, it's a weak window. Is that just a feeling, or can Europe really stand on its two feet and play a relevant role, possibly as a middleman in the Asia-Pacific?
Well, I think there are a couple things here. The first is that in order for other states to trust Europe, Europe needs to first trust itself. And I think this has been a tension that those of us who watch European security pretty closely have been dealing with for years. One of the reasons that the United States is so needed on the European continent, putting aside the fact that we created the security architecture between the United States and Europe this way, was because the Europeans simply don't have the defense technologies and the critical enablers to defend their continent without American support. Now, of course, you have homegrown defense technologies in places like Germany, France, Poland, Italy. I mean, these are worth talking about, and they're getting stronger, but they need to be better integrated within the European continent, separate from the United States first, before I think we can start talking about how Europe projects power into another region. I was talking about the Trump administration before, and I think when it comes to European involvement in the Indo-Pacific, there's also a political difference in the United States as well. You had Kurt Campbell, who was working for both Biden and Obama. He was a key architect of the pivot to Asia. This idea of coexistence or coexistence with competition without catastrophe when it comes to China. Regional engagement and a key role for Europe in this region. Now, in the Trump administration, you have a similar personality in Elbridge Colby that's running China policy, who, and by similar personality, I just mean that he's kind of seen as the eminent force on this front in the United States at the moment. His approach is much different. It's a strategy of denying China regional hegemony along the first island chain. It's very military-centric deterrence. And there's really no role for Europe in this vision. So when it comes to Europe's role in the Indo-Pacific, it shouldn't do this to try to placate the United States. It should do this to build its own relationships beyond that of the US, to help strengthen its own defense and security architecture, and to work on, as I said before, building these relationships that I think will become more and more important as the US reorients elsewhere and inward.
Professor Pan, the delegation of the US, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, last February, I think, was the largest for a visit of a sitting President of the Commission to India. A few events have occurred since the visit, and as far as trade is concerned, Europe seems weaker than it looked last February. Are you still hopeful that some deal can be cracked in the near future? One that would be mutually beneficial, of course.
Well, I think when it comes to India-EU trade agreements, so it's best to avoid any speculation. We have been talking about it since I think we were in kindergarten. But I do think that India-Europe relationship has changed and changed for the better and evolved dramatically. And one of the most important aspects of the change has been Europe's engagement in the Indo-Pacific. If Europe were the Europe of the past, if Europe were not talking about the Indo-Pacific, then I don't think the relationship would have looked like this today. And the optimism around, I mean, there is a fair degree of optimism that the deal still can be reached, which I think speaks about a change that has come in Europe's perspective vis-a-vis Indo-Pacific, vis-a-vis its own geopolitical aspirations, vis-a-vis India. And I think it also speaks to the fact that India is looking at alternatives like Europe to strengthen its position. I think Ken talked about in the Indo-Pacific itself, that if America is missing in action, then are there other players there that you can rely on, that you can build partnerships with, that can help you navigate this very turbulent phase. And I think Europe, with all its limitations, remains a valuable, first of all, a norm setter, And then, of course, as it gains some salience, and I think Rachel's point about having confidence in itself, about its ability to deliver. And if it is able to do that, I think India certainly would be hoping that it would invest much more time and energy in the Indo-Pacific than it has done in the past. But of course, that's also the challenge, and one, when you are strategizing or thinking analytically, you also have to look at the constraints that Europe faces at the moment, which is not simply the fact that the build-up of defense capability has just started, but also the fact that the European periphery is in a mess and it's sort of burning, and so issues closer to home will always take precedence over the Indo-Pacific narrative that had been set and be evolving. So I think there is a tension there, but countries like India and Japan certainly would welcome greater European participation, greater European engagement, and I'm sure ASEAN also would welcome that, because ASEAN's partnership with Europe has also been growing in a different context, but certainly from India and Japan's perspective, with a very focused strategic intent.
Commenting on your was it a few words saying that Europe, the domestic or what is close to home takes precedence, but in the words of President Xi, everything is domestic. So the Indo-Pacific could also be seen as a domestic priority. Professor Jimbo, I mentioned earlier the question of personalities, and it's true that Prime Minister Modi is one of the most charismatic leaders in the landscape today. He's also one of the longest standing now. The same could be said about Prime Minister Abe, and much of what he has built, or a bit of what he has built, let's be more humble, moderate, has not really survived him. Do you think that there can be such a cooperation framework in the Indo-Pacific that can survive whoever is in power today?
Well, I think it's the matter of how much those I think, the character who can really lead the process to set the standards. And next things we should do is how much you can really institutionalize it. So why we created so much unilateral, expanding alliance relationship with partnering with Korea, Philippines, Australia, India as the common practices, we could regularize the cooperation as it does a formal institution, is about that kind of system can be durable to the change of the leadership. And things are very hard to manage because different leader may have different priorities. But once that there is institutional settings are there, military to military relationship will sustain, and then we can create as a default of the cooperation before any kinds of priority under the radar screen of the political concerns may really hinder the process to move ahead. So that the maturity comes with how much of the rulemaking and also institutionalization taking place whenever that kind of cooperation could be created.
Thank you. I've let time fly, and we have less than 10 minutes for questions. If you can, be so kind as to briefly introduce yourself, state your affiliation, and a question with a question mark.
My name is Hino Samuel Jose. I used to be working with the government, so I can speak freely now because I'm no longer in the government. But yeah, I'm from let's just use the ASEAN Youth Forum. Okay, so I have couple of response and question maybe that could be addressed by the speaker.
One would be great.
Okay, already. Sure. Okay, one thing first. In Europe, the anxiety is on nuclear. In Indo-Pacific, it's maritime, of course, the domain. And then I think, therefore, we need to energize IORA. And of course, I would like to seek the speaker's response on this. And last point is, I think we need to ensure, in order for us to energize the Indonesia-India relation for Indo-Pacific, we need to appoint a lead person. With China, we used to have Minister Luhut. How about with India? Who? Maybe from the Indonesia, the strong man.
Okay.
And then lastly, I think in Indonesia, we are lucky that regardless of what political party is the president affiliated with, foreign policy major and foundational principle will not change. Unlike the US, unlike the Europe, and maybe unlike India.
I think this is an
Yeah, I think that's all. The points that I want to
Thank you.
make. And to close, I think that's why 2+2 dialogue to strengthen the connectivity between the two countries, the foreign minister and the defense minister between Indonesia and India are important. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The point perhaps, yeah, we might take, right. If you have a good memory, fine, it's a good test. Sir, please.
Oh, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I'm from Ivan Lidari from ISIS, National University of Singapore. So my question is for Harsh. First, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Obviously, if the worst happens and the US practically stops defense cooperation with India, obviously this will have enormous impact on Indian arms procurement, defense technology development, and so on. So how would India react to this in terms of its defense industry, and how this will impact its cooperation with other countries within the Quad or more broadly, including Indonesia and so on? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think we can stop. We have two. Well, I'll take just one. I'm very sorry because I really want to give our panelists the opportunity of answering and closing.
Yeah, I'm Jay. I've lived here all my life. I have a question about CATSA. I mean, is India and Indonesia still afraid of CATSA?
It's a lot of questions for you, huh? So you wanted to hear them all. And, okay. Right. We can. But perhaps we start with you because it's been a lot about India. So.
See, I think you have jumped a lot of hoops to reach the conclusion that it's a good hypothetical, but it's still far off the radar. I don't think. I don't think the intent is to stop all defense cooperation, because after all, Mr. Trump wants India to buy greater defense equipment. That's what he suggested in his first meeting with the Prime Minister himself. So I don't think the intent is to go there. But I think whatever we have heard so far, it seems to be more of a tactical pressure tactic to reach to a certain end game from his perspective, which is a bilateral trading agreement as quickly as possible. So I think maybe that would not happen. But the good news is, I think even if that happens, let's assume that the worst happens and it just escalates to a point where India becomes the most important strategic challenge for the US, and therefore dismantling of the whole relationship is on the cards. I think on defense, because India has, of course, the problem with India had been that India has been buying too much of Russian weaponry. That's what Americans and Europeans have been telling India, that you have to stop doing that. Now, if that happens, then of course, India is slightly better positioned, given our defense relationship with Russia, so that Russians will, whatever little leverage they have at the moment, will continue to help us. But broadly, I think diversification is where India has been going since the end of the Cold War. And diversification is something that allows you resilience when such situations arise. So I'm hoping that would prevail. On CATSA, I think I don't think at the moment. I think the biggest issue is Mr. Trump. CATSA and other things are peripheral, but India had done very well last time when Mr. Trump was in office. So I think that's what was mentioned earlier on, that America had a special place for India. We were giving waivers on a lot of things, including dealings with Russians, including the Chabhar port, for example, etc. I think given how important a trade agreement with India seems to be for Mr. Trump, everything has come together. So you see that the Russian element is being brought back, Iran element is brought back into negotiations, and of course the Pakistani element is back. So he has discovered energy in Pakistan, and apparently an energy deal has been signed with Pakistan. So there are a lot of issues that have converged for India, and I don't think therefore that old issues are the worry for India-US relationship. It's this new convergence that he has found on a range of issues which are probably propelling a lot of these problems.
Thank you. So we have 1 minute, which means 30 seconds, less than 30 seconds 20 seconds for each of you. And I just want you to hear your concluding thoughts. But I think the comment from the gentleman about countries able to project political changes to their political identity was a very good comment. So perhaps you want to integrate that to your conclusion.
I think that what really constitutes the characters of the Indo-Pacific is the size of the geography, which is so different from what you find in Europe. Everything can be connected as a theater, connectivities and all things, but we are so diverse in a sense. We share so many common issues, but the way we can really compartmentalize is the way we can really address our own solutions, so that how much we can, work together, but to compartmentalize as a scale is something that you can really achieve those autonomy sense into the region.
Thank you so much for keeping the time.
Just one quick thing that kind of focuses on U.S.-India. I think there's an assumption amongst many countries that the more Trump needs them in the competition with China or Russia, the more inoculated they'll be from Trump's mercurial nature. And it's actually the opposite. The more integral Trump views countries to his ultimate goals, the harder he'll push. And that's, I think, what we're seeing in India. But as you mentioned before, all politics is domestic. It really depends on how tariffs hit the United States industrial community, the heartland, and we forget that there's also a massive Indian diaspora community in the United States that Trump will need to contend with at some point.
All right, thank you so much. So I'll just answer the question that hasn't been answered, which is about nuclear problems. Which is quite interesting. In Asia, I think, this is rarely talked about, but there is a proliferation of nuclear in terms of submarines and at sea. So the largest fleet of nuclear submarines is actually, especially with nuclear ballistic missile, is actually Russia in the Asia-Pacific, and this is rarely talked about. And we see that China is starting to build Jin-class submarine as well, which has ballistic missile. And the other, I think, the Australia and India is currently, Australia in the future have like Virginia class, and India has Arihant and Arigard. Those are not ballistic missile submarines, but those are nuclear powered. So one thing for sure, ASEAN is not actually ready for this. And I think we do have like a protocol on like nuclear disaster, but we are not prepared to the scale of like nuclear warfare. I mean, like that's the worst scenario for all of us. So I think one of the things for sure, currently we only have like a gray zone warfare in the South China Sea, and we would like to keep it that way. And hopefully, I think we can actually prevent all of that from happening. But yes, so I think the nuclear deterrence between each other is still working in the Asia-Pacific.
Oh, thank you. I think it was such an important concluding point at a time when, even in Europe, we hear some countries saying we need to either increase our stockpiles or actually start with one. So thank you for ending on a positive note on generally a so negative a topic. We had a wonderful panel, so I think they all deserve a wonderful round of applause because they've been very brave. Thank you very much. And on this, I hand over to our wonderful host.